So yesterday, I posted why I reached for Droid in my coding workflow, specifically around how it handles context windows. And that post hit over 77,000 views. And honestly, a lot of you have actually asked super technical questions that I really couldn't answer. So today, I've got Luke Alvoeiro joining me. And Luke spent 3.5 years at Block, where he built Goose. It's an AI agent that 5,000 Block engineers use every single week. And now he's actually at Factory building droids and the agent scaffoldings more specifically. Factory is actually sponsoring this live stream, but here's the real reason why we're doing this. I ran a 7 million token session without creating a new chat or losing context. And I wanted to really understand, how is that actually possible? This isn't a marketing pitch. It's literally just going to be two engineers sitting down, chatting about the actual technical architecture. And as a live stream audience, you're welcome to ask any questions and just slide them right into the chat. And I'll be able to kind of cook with you, as we can kind of see my friend get max droid mode. If you've been following my streams, you saw me use Cursor a few days ago, and I still use it. But I've been reaching for Droid more for extended sessions, and I wanted to understand why it feels a little bit different. So this is actually going to be me actually learning alongside with you. And we're going to go deep on the agent scaffolding, incremental summarization, how context actually gets managed, and what Luke learned from deploying this at Block with thousands of engineers. So if you're watching this, you're likely very intelligent, and you know this isn't just about picking the winners. It's just us trying to understand this architecture behind what's actually working. And if you want to test this out yourself, I got you 40 million tokens specifically for my audience. The link is actually in the description. And if you're watching this on other platforms, it's rfer.me/rayfactory. And Luke, I'm so excited to have you on the stream. This is just actually super insane to get you here. There's been a lot of communication, and I kind of want to start really quickly around the context bottlenecks before getting into your background at Goose that kind of led into this, because to me, this feels like magic. And how can I get a continuous session like this without resetting or creating a new chat window and so forth?
Yeah, no. Thanks for first of all having me on the live stream. It's super cool to kind of be able to engage with our users in this way. Um, Context is definitely something that we've thought very very heavily about. And actually, the Factory web app also is like an entirely different product that's out there that folks use. And so this goes back about a year ago when we were starting to think about context and how do we manage that correctly. I think the thing that has stood out that just like works best is first of all thinking about context as a problem that continually you have to address throughout that session lifecycle, and then thinking about it from like an iterative perspective. So one of our engineers, Theo, kind of put out this like blog post about how he's been thinking about context in the context of Factory, and how you like kind of led us to this like really unique approach. Specifically, we think about context as something that grows, and then at some point you have to compress kind of the session back into a state that is manageable. We've seen that typically LLM models operate at an ideal context window of about but probably 140K tokens. And so if we can make sure that we're within that like sweet spot, we're delivering the best experience to our users. In the past, we've looked at this problem from many different directions, right? So we first thought about this from what I would kind of consider maybe an overcomplicated perspective. We had a document that listed out what had been accomplished so far in a session. We had another document that listed kind of like what the user had provided in terms of like their kind of stuff that they wanted to like elicit out of the model themselves. And we managed all of these multiple documents in a very like kind of heavy-handed way, I would say. But what we found, honestly, with kind of in the last 6 months and also inside of Droid CLI, is it's best to start with a simpler approach, right? So taking something like, let's just first start with, once you reach, let's say, that 140K token window, let's just compress everything, right? And then, come up with a really good prompt to provide a model like, let's say, Sonnet 4.5, and see where we get there, right? Okay, and then that naturally will find a lot of pitfalls there, and so we have to start iterating on that. One of the things that we noticed when we were hill climbing on Terminal Bench, which again, I wouldn't say you should dive fully into optimizing for a benchmark, but it does kind of give you a lot of signal as to what you're doing well and what you aren't doing yet, is as we were looking through all of these model traces, we saw, hey, you know what's happening? We're spending a lot of time um, kind of after we do these compression points, refiguring out what needs to happen inside of the session. So you'd start exploring files again. You'd start kind of looking back at what changes you'd made via like Git summaries, like Git diffs, right? And so what we really found was there's a few core things that, regardless of how you compress, need to stick around in the same form, right? You need to kind of hotwire the model to have the latest like changes that have been made inside of this session. You need to also provide it with something that's really important is like the to-do list that is getting worked on, right? So if the model has already gone down one trajectory, let's say 50% of the way, it should be aware of that. It should know that like exactly at what step it's operating at. And so, that naive approach of initially just compressing everything now starts to change. You start adding a lot more kind of tooling and scaffolding around that compaction, like kind of methodology that you first implemented. And then all of this, you have to still keep in mind, how do we do this from a prompt caching perspective that feels append only to the model so that everything feels just as fast as, your session up until that compaction point normally feels.
That's an incredible like exploration because there's so many different avenues here to like if somebody just says, are you just some type of wrapper around Claude Sonnet or Codex or these types of things? It's actually kind of insulting because that means you're not paying attention to these little details. And these details actually matter in what Luke is, you're saying, right? Because how you compress information, how the model behaves after the next step, like you're saying, to gather this information, that can take up more context. And then trying to like micromanage that on the fly, to me, has been my biggest headache too, because when I'm doing this in Claude Code or in other agents like Codex or even inside of Cursor's stuff too, I'm like constantly looking for the context window. And I'm like, okay, am I approaching 50%? I notice I get much more rot. But the other thing that I also noticed for myself in my own experience was the fact that I have these Agent.MD files in my repo. And these are placed in very strategic places inside of folders. So in a folder, for example, for my backend, I have, descriptions of like, hey, I'm using Convex. It's very reactive. It actually behaves a little bit differently when you're going to be operating in here. And one of the problems I have in some of these platforms, especially as the context window grows, I notice it doesn't really follow my agents.md file as it usually does. But with the Droid session throughout the 7 million token session and the subsequent one yesterday that we just did live was like 6 million tokens, it kept staying on track. I didn't have to keep reminding it certain things. Like, what are you also doing there as well? And like, are there differences between rules files? Because I know Claude has a Claude MD file, and I didn't have to have Claude MD file specifically, when using the Droid agent. So tell me a little bit more about kind of that too, and like how you're managing that, because that seems to be some of the flaws, like you're saying, these agents kind of forget, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I would say like a lot of that context management is really on the builder of the agent to manage. It's not so much on the model itself. You're naturally kind of compressing context back into one or two messages and you're sending that off to the LM. And I think it would be naive to say that like the LLM will gather everything correctly, right? So it's on us to make sure that the LLM sees the correct things. And as I mentioned, the to-do list was one important thing that we identified early on as like this needs to persist. But like you're saying, stuff like Agents.MD, the recursive structure for Agents.MD, making sure that's always loaded into a session is incredibly important. And then also making sure that like what you are extracting out of the model is actually like the way that a human or like anyone else would convey information about what you've been working on thus far to someone else. So you could say, if I'm handing off a bunch of work to you, right? I wouldn't actually just tell you, hey, I'm working on this ticket, good luck. I would tell you, this is what the ticket is about. Here's some information about how to like reproduce an issue, or let's say like kind of point you towards where in the UI or in the code, like this feature needs to be built. I'll give you a bunch of clarifications. I'll tell you, these are probably the files that need to be worked on. Here are some errors I've kind of run into the past. Here's some approaches I've tried but have not worked out. And all of that gets built into our like compression context management system, such that when you do that like handover of context, it's intuitive for the model and it has all the information it needs in order to be successful.
That's amazing. And I feel like this is, if folks who haven't tried it, I think when you start kind of using it, it's really amazing to feel this experience of not having to create new chats. Sometimes if you're kind of used to always having this anxiety, and I like 6 million tokens like used like yesterday would have been like 30 chats easily, just new type of thing. And in my building process, when I'm usually like coding not live, I move way fast, right? So I'm planning, I'm building, and iterating on bugs and bug fixing, and then just kind of going back and forth right away. And what's nice is I don't have to remind it that I'm working on my spec file. So I want to talk a little bit more about like specs and plans and what does that mean? Because I see plan mode in various apps, and then, Claude Code, Cursor has plan mode too, and everyone's kind of introducing this concept. And you guys have spec mode. Is there a difference? Is it just naming, marketing? Like what's kind of the intent there?
Yeah, I think there's obviously similarities, right? Cloud Code's plan mode is incredibly capable, but the way I would frame kind of how we stand out here is Claude is thinking more about the plan from a perspective of what is the agent going to do next, kind of like a step-by-step goal of getting you to the end state that you described in your initial prompt, right? We think about spec mode more as like a holistic specification for building software. And specifically, like if you think about how you would hand off working from like that PRD phase of building kind of a document that outlines exactly what you want, and then moving into engineering design, and then eventually building kind of a prototype or something like that. There's multiple stages and multiple like requirements that you're hitting along the way. Specifically, you're going to think about what you're actually trying to build, who the target audience is, kind of like how you're going to measure success, how what are the pitfalls of this product that you're building, or this like experience that you're building. And so that is really the core of what we're trying to get at with spec mode, is getting at a holistic sense of like what is the feature that you're trying to build and how we'll measure success for it, right? So I think we've seen a lot of folks internally been using spec mode. In fact, it kind of is like the daily driver for everyone. So if you haven't used Droids or spec mode yet, I would suggest going into session and using the shift tab like hotkey to move straight into spec mode and get started with your sessions that way. That is like by far the most successful way to, I think, use Factory right now. And we're going to specifically be rolling out a bunch of enhancements to that style of workflow in the coming like weeks. Specifically, I think, some of our engineers are using this and they're saying, hey, iterating on that spec is a bit slow. And naturally, like that kind of just, grabbed everyone's ears. We're like, okay, wait, we totally need to fix that. So you should be seeing that experience be a lot quicker. But, I think the agent having this spec mode is also incredibly useful in being able to kind of keep track of its progress better. We preserve that after any compression point. We make sure that like across all of our like online and benchmark evals that is like that spec mode is being respected very, very heavily. And so as long as you can kind of iterate to a really good spec at the beginning of your session, we've seen that Droid can execute on it really, really well.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask about like kind of a feature request here. And one of the things I like about Cursor's plan mode is that you can actually hit the little save button and it saves it, and you can edit it or do different types of things. And then yesterday when I was running my Droid session, I basically had this massive 2,000 line like big spec document off of research, because of the feature was pretty large and I wanted to split it up and stack diffs. And I just kind of went through this really crazy spec thing, because I just really wanted to push the limits here too. And then I noticed that like I also hit like a tool call like limit. I guess there's only so many lines that a file can be read out or read and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
so it ended up splitting up the file and so forth. And I would have just loved to, and I think there may be a setting. I'm not sure if it's still there anymore. If you can just, I think there's like a, maybe in this Droid settings to save the spec. Is that still there or is that something?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's still there. And that's actually
Okay.
a feature that I use pretty often because I think it's actually pretty helpful to be able to um, kind of think about the droid as a person just trying to accomplish a task. If you've given it the wrong set of specs initially, like naturally your outcome is not going to be what you wanted. And so actually saving that file via the slash settings command is actually really, really important, I think, in kind of building more developer agent trust. Being able to open that file, change it, and then have the agent kind of respond naturally to those changes is actually like a really like intuitive workflow, I think, to anyone who kind of works with like these markdown files as like a point of reference. And so, you'd think of the same way of working with like a README or like some like onboarding documentation for any repository that you're working with. So I think, yeah, that's definitely something that we're thinking about quite heavily is like, how do we make it more intuitive for folks to use this like specification mode? In the past, in our web app, we've explored a bunch of different ways of doing this. We had like the plans be editable in real time. So, the Droid could kind of like pick up changes as you type them out. And that was, I would say, again, one of those systems that we may have overcomplicated, but I think the intent was really good there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, talking a little bit about your background too, let's kind of pop into that before we kind of get into the next thing about context management and summarization and some of the other really good technical stuff. But I think some of the audience may want to learn a little bit more about you. And for those who aren't really connected into the like straight up teapot of X/Twitter, um, they may hear terms like block. What is block? What is Goose? Creator. What are some of those types of things? So tell us a little bit more of kind of like where you come from, maybe
Yeah.
the efforts of Block the company and how Goose came to be, and then like what that is and why it's so important to the work that you're actually doing today at Factory.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been kind of focused on developer experience in some form or fashion for at least the past 5 years. I've been kind of started my career building Square's external product for developers. So that is like their API and their app marketplace. And then I quickly moved over to internal developer productivity. So I was on our dev tooling team right around the time that like GPT 3.5 popped off. And of course, everyone at that point in time was thinking, how can I like apply this to developer tools, right? This is like a fundamental shift in how we work. This is like the era of CTOs wanting a like fine-tuned model or fine-tuned version of like GitHub Copilot to be deployed at every company, and that was like the hottest thing that was out there. But internally, we were thinking, okay, we were on the team that just rolled out Copilot. We were like, how can we make this experience of using these models even more organic to like a developer's workflow? So I started building some tools that would auto generate tests for all of our like major repositories, and eventually landed on building essentially like a while loop around an LLM that was equipped with some tools, right? And so that was roughly 2 years ago, before Claude Code or Codex CLI ever existed. A tool that was pretty hot in the space was Aider, and that was really focused on kind of how could you apply like patches to files very successfully. And so we naturally borrowed some of the learnings from there and built out a CLI tool that was Goose. And so me and this other engineer at Block is the parent company of Square, for folks who don't know. His name was Bradley Axon. We were building this together and really excited about this, and started to get kind of a little bit more traction internally. So we had more and more folks joining the team, and started sharing out Goose internally with engineers across the company, right? Trying to think about like, how do we onboard 5,000 engineers to this tool that's radically like shifting the developer workflow, right? And obviously there's like kind of pushback from folks that enjoyed, writing code by hand. Um, also a lot of excitement. And so we were also thinking about this from a non-developer tooling perspective, I would say. Like, how do we bring, some of the success that we've had with Goose in our developer community to non-developer folks inside of the company? That was, I think, the like initial bud that led us to a bigger picture for Goose. Specifically, that picture kind of mirrored that of like MCP. For folks who aren't aware, is like a server-based system where you can kind of extend any agent that is compatible with MCP servers with like custom tooling that corresponds to like a particular use case, right? So something like having a MCP server for Sentry or for Salesforce, something like that, and being able to access like the tools that correspond to that system. Goose was like kind of building towards releasing something like MCP, and then actually MCP came out, and we were like, oh, whoa, like this is exactly what we were building, and pivoted kind of a little bit away from that and back towards focusing on like an open source product that anyone could use, and also tooling that was specific to Block and to like our kind of problems. And so I think one of the things that is very much like a learning from that experience is it's important to be involved in the agent building process in order to understand what are like the micro decisions that you need to make in order for your product to be good. And that's kind of what led me actually to Factory. I have this like core belief that general purpose agents have some limitations, right? Versus a focused agent. Nowadays, we're seeing that like agents of scaffolding is kind of like the most important thing to be building correctly. And so having a narrow focus on the problem set means that scaffolding, you can iterate on it very, very closely, right? As opposed to a general purpose agent, which you need to make sure that scaffolding has kind of the virtues of any single problem and can solve any single problem correctly. So that's why I moved to Factory. I had this like developer tooling background. I really wanted to continue working on that space. And I wanted to build like the best agent out there for not only coding, but like for tasks that span the entire software development lifecycle. I mean, we were hearing from all of our engineering leaders who are like, okay, like Goose is great at this, but what about this? What about review now? That's the next thing to tackle. And I certainly agree. Folks are going to be bottlenecked by whatever you don't build. So we have to continue kind of iterating on that entire SDLC. And I think Factory has just a bunch of engineers and a bunch of people generally who are so excited about this problem. So I guess it's a plug to Factory. It's like if you are someone who just loves working on developer tooling and loves to think about AI and how you can make these agents incrementally better every single day, I think Factory would be a great fit, and we are hiring if that is of interest.
That's a phenomenal background, phenomenal story, and I like how you brought some of the history in because that's pretty important because these have completely evolved over time, and it's amazing because a lot of us who are even watching this stream right now, at some point in time, start to realize that same intelligence behind this thing, right? And to see your passion driven and say, okay, I need to solve this problem, and beyond the agent loop thing, it leads us into like kind of the next part of what I kind of want to talk about, like some of the technical deep dives, right? To put this stuff together, some of the experiments you've tried, like other companies are doing like compression or summarizing of the chat, like you kind of were saying earlier. Like, can you talk a little bit more about what anchored summaries are and kind of what that really means technically, I guess, or like in more detail?
Yeah, for sure. So for folks who are joining right now, just kind of what we're discussing it has to do with like Droid's context management system and how we compress messages over time once you get to a certain like token value, and that's what really powers the ability to go to like a 7 million token session and still have everything work correctly and kind of lead to the outcomes that you want. So these anchor points, if you think about like the message history that you are kind of conversing with an LLM, there's naturally a message that leads to us considering, hey, this session is now kind of out of the context limit that we would consider to be optimal. And so whenever we reach those points, we say, okay, we have to now summarize a lot of the messages that have happened in this session thus far, structure them in such a way that we do capture intent, the overall approach, these like clarification questions that the user may have asked, still capture stuff like our to-do list, capture stuff like Agent.MD that we discussed before. But those messages are what we consider to be the anchor points, right? So whenever compression does occur, we anchor to that message and we say everything before this needs to get compressed. We need to like summarize it. And we do that using an LLM. And then I think that the next question is, okay, what happens when you hit that anchor point again? Or sorry, hit that compression point again? What happens to the message that becomes the anchor point? So that previous message that was the anchor point now has, let's say 100 more messages after it has hit that we've now hit that like compaction threshold. And so we take that first message, which has a lot of detailed information about the session thus far, give it a lot of weighting in our LLM summary that comes next, and then also provide kind of all of those same messages that follow and to the to-do list, the Agent.MD, make sure that all of that is respected correctly when we do our next summarization. And so I think, as I mentioned before, we've tried like complicating this more and making it, a more advanced system. But I think what we've ultimately found is that we need to ship an experience that's like bug-free in order for adoption to really kind of take off the way that it has. And so making sure that our system is simple, but like very well thought out with all of those like addendums that are important is I think like what has made management like solution really, really strong.
That's super fascinating because there's a lot of approaches, and like you say, every single company who's working on this problem is going to try different sets of things. I, for one, personally used quite a bit of products, and this one just kind of feels really smooth and easy, and I'm not having to purge or exit things, or like you said, manage or open new chats and try different things. I'm using Agents.MD files, and I'm bringing in context when it does, and it just feels nice to not have to like kind of do that type of extra prompting or stuff to kind of pull things in. And so another question I had, because you've dropped this word before, and I guess it's the word called scaffolding or agent scaffolding. And everyone's today is talking about prompting, context management, and so forth. Let's kind of dive a little bit more into like what that means for you and this term of what that entails, because not only do you also work with Sonnet 4.5, which is I was using a lot, but you're also working with GPT-5, and then there's different characteristics and behaviors between these models. But Droid also supports GLM. You can even bring your own keys and your own open source models too if you wanted to do this. So you don't have to pay a monthly fee. You can run a local version of this and have Droid as the actual agent that's actually running and interacting with that thing. So let's talk a little bit more about scaffolding and kind of what that means as well for the audience.
Yeah, for sure. And I would just encourage folks, like if you are kind of hesitant to try it out, definitely give that BYOK solution like a try. That way you don't need to try even paying for droids, right? Like it's incredibly easy to just get started. But going into like agent scaffolding, I think like the core thing to understand here is there's hundreds of behavioral just like configurations and different patterns that are embedded within any agent tool that you're building. And so these manifest in the form of stuff like system notifications, tool descriptions, the way that tools are actually implemented, the timeouts that you provide to tools, how long you even plan on waiting for like an LLM response, right? The way that you prompt cache and the way that your message history is structured. As well as something like a model agnostic harness, right? That sort of works well with any model that you plug in. And so one of the things that I think we did really, really well in the past 6 months is building around like only using or actually building around using many different models, right? So making sure that is like the way that we structure our code base such that it is incredibly easy to onboard to a new model, test it out, see how good it is, and really give it like its best shot, right? And like not just like plug a model in and call it like a day. Like we really need to make sure that whenever we onboard to a new model, we give it all of the capabilities that every other really good model has. So that is, everything that I outlined before, like system notifications, model specific tool descriptions, and also honestly like model specific tools. So one of the things that I think is like important to call out is, nowadays OpenAI style models have some like specific way that they prefer to run tools, right? So specifically around like editing and creating files, they have this tool called apply patch that is a very like proprietary way of applying a diff to a certain file. Whereas, uh, the Anthropics of this world are using a different style of tool, which is more of like a find and replace, based on text and kind of like your Git diff format. And so, that naturally leads to like, if you had just plugged in a new model and tested it out, you would actually see like significantly degraded performance if you were not using those custom tools that are specific to each one of those models. So that's an example of like scaffolding done right, where you have built out scaffolding that's model specific. And again, to folks building agentic products out there, I would actually like start with that design choice in mind. Agents are really like as good as their weakest link. So if you want to like hill climb on the quality of your agent, I would say like minimize the chance of negative trajectories as much as possible. And what does that look like in practice? That is really just like focusing on like bug fixing as much as you can. So stuff like, file editing issues we ran into the past with like new line characters. You'd think, oh, that's a minor thing. No, because as you kind of grow on the number of sessions that occur out there, like now you're having this bug, hundreds, thousands of times per day. Making sure that you have the right nudge mechanisms for file changes, for ID diagnostics that may occur, lint warnings, making sure that you're using things like backgrounding processes correctly so that users can kind of benefit from, hey, I've started a server, like let me not halt my entire agent loop just to
Oh,
run
I
this
see.
server, but instead be able to proceed from that point onwards.
Oh,
And naturally,
wow.
like tuning different tool timeouts so that the product feels really really snappy. All of these are things that like fall into the context of like fixing tool bugs and context management, really, if you think about it more broadly. But this like scaffolding is something that I would consider to be like the new way that we should be talking about building agents, because it's like holistic, right? Like just because your context management system is great doesn't mean that your agent is great, because there's other things that go into it. Another example of this that I can provide is like how you think about speed, right? One of the pitfalls of our current web app experience is around the speed, because it was built for like a different model with different capabilities, specifically that being like Sonnet 3.5 back in the day. Now our CLI is built with the latest models in mind, and kind of since it was like a relatively like newer project, has like a lot better prompt caching for like the tasks that we kind of run inside of these sessions. So specifically thinking about a message history that's append only, right? In order to never break the cache, means that you are operating inside of sessions much, much quicker, which leads to better outcomes and faster outcomes for your users. And naturally, like keeping things linear inside of a session also gives the agent some grounding as to like what occurred in the past. If you're like pulling messages in and out and trying to manipulate context in that like what I would call like more advanced way, you're actually in some ways shooting yourself in the foot, because you're kind of confusing the model as you go.
That is fascinating, especially this really technical attention to detail for kind of understanding how like to build a conversation for these language models and then maybe trying different approach. Because there was a really good question from Human Jesse, and I want to call it out here. And it's just around like, people trying these different techniques. And he's saying, I'm curious what you think about graph rag in compression to semantic summary. Is that something you guys have tried? Is that something, in your background, have you like gone to this newer model that you're saying, just by doing this append mode to be much more reliable more often? Kind of what is your thinking there?
Yeah, I think honestly, like the way I would think about this is start with the simplest solution and measure it, right? I think like we've tried solving problems in the past without doing those two very important steps at the beginning, and have like not been able to then assess, what really is kind of like the starting point here that we should be hill climbing on top of. So again, I think that's like the most important thing to do. We have used both approaches in our products at various different points, and I think that like RAG in that sense, like both for graphs and semantic summaries, is still like a very useful tool. But I do think that as we as we think about kind of like prompt caching quite heavily, I think that the use case for RAG dwindles a little bit. It's still highly relevant to problem solving. But what we've seen nowadays is like models are incredibly capable at doing the research kind of like proactively. And so as long as you're giving them the right initial set of context, so I would say like, in that specification file, making sure that like the sources that you're aware of are pulled in there. And obviously, if that you're using RAG, I think that's like an incredibly good use case of it. Um, I think that is the right format for RAG right now. And then letting the model really do that investigation and use that prompt cache and sort of like maximize the overlap between how the model is running inside of this session and how the model was like post trained to work. Right. If you can do that, then you have like the best chance of success.
Wow. That's for anyone listening. If you're building agents, there's a lot of amazing nuggets here. And I'm really enjoying this like deep dive. Like, if you are too, just drop the thumbs up in the chat. I know Human Jesse is also dropping the thumbs up as well. I appreciate that. Cause I mean, this is just really fun. I know people have been asking some questions and I've been kind of getting lost because I'm trying to keep track and also have my questions in mind. And I think what I want to go ahead and do is like probably have a little bit of a section very shortly, maybe coming up next after we talk about parallelizations. And we talked a little bit about spec and planning. And that way we can kind of participate with our audience here. Because I know you guys may have some questions too in terms of like maybe the Droid architecture, why it works in a certain way. I know other people are having other questions that they want to get set up because this is also part of the community thing. So feel free to start dropping the questions now if you had them kind of queued up in the background. I may have lost them because there's been a lot of questions coming in. But to kind of get things started, you also talked about parallelization. When you're running the agents, if it's spinning up a server or you're waiting on some things, you can do some other stuff in parallel. And so how does you talked a little bit, I can kind of get a sense of how the context can stay coherent within the parallel tasks, but like, what are some of the trade-offs and how do you not blow out a context window? For example, like I have an MCP server and then it reads one single, entry from my database and it's a big transcription for like a 4-hour live stream. And it's like, boom, I ate up all my context window. That actually happened to me when I was live streaming like a couple months ago. I was using one of these agents. I was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize this could happen. Of course, yeah, I'm debugging something and that's kind of what came up. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that sort of like falls into that like more meta topic of agent scaffolding, to be honest. It's like, again, this is not like really managing context. It more has to do with like your tool implementations, right? And how have you spent enough time debugging through a bunch of different sessions to be able to tell, regularly we're working on this, like, this eval or this like problem set, and we're just hitting these like out of context issues all the time. What's happening? Oh, there's like this massive file that we just, cannot, logically like read because it's so big. So therefore we should operate always under viewing a max content of, let's say, 500 lines of code whenever, looking at a file, or let's say like 100,000 characters or something like that, is one way to think about that sort of problem. But speaking more to like the parallelization topic, I think there's like multiple things here, right? We've seen products in the space, let's say, Claude Code, come out with a sub-agent solution. And I think there's like a lot of value in that, in this like approach to compressing context. Naturally, like the way that sort of sub-agent works is the model will call a sub-agent. That sub-agent will do a bunch of work, and then at the end return like a structured output of, this is everything that was done. This is the findings, and then hand that back over to the main model. And so naturally, there's this long conversation thread that gets compressed into that large finding at the very end, and then you preserve some of your context inside of that session. That's the way that like a lot of products are approaching this like parallelization problem. But I think there's like something that's inherently like missing from all tools in the space right now, including ours, to be quite honest, and that is like a breakdown of what we mean by parallelization. Right? There's multiple different types of parallelization in like a software engineering task. There's like the intertask parallelization, so being able to work across, let's say, 5 different tasks at once. I would kind of like call these tasks something akin to like a linear ticket, right? So like being able to work on many of these at the same time, and make sure that like you're not bottlenecked by anything. Let that be, the coding portion of the work or the review portion of the work. There's like intra-task parallelization, right? So working on within one task, within one of those linear tickets, how do I parallelize within that setting? And so that could be something like sub-agents, but it could also be sort of like a best of n sort of approach, where you spawn many different droids working across, let's say, like different Git work trees, and then end up choosing the most viable solution. You could have many agents working on the same branch together, right? And so not really, use this concept of sub-agents, but instead have them work kind of collaboratively, maybe using the same point of reference doc as like a working kind of model as to like how, what has been done so far inside of this like larger session. And then another third kind of way of thinking about parallelization is just like a large task, decomposing it, which involves sort of like a mix of both intertask and intra-task parallelization. And so, with all this in mind, I feel like parallelization is quite honestly like the big problem to solve for a lot of these coding tools in the next like 6 months or so. We naturally right now feel very bottlenecked by review. I think that's like huge for B. And all of these different problems are very different, or would involve very different solutions. So I think our role as like a tool that's thinking heavily about AI coding and AI in the software development lifecycle is to make all of these very intuitive to developers. Right now there's a lot of folks thinking about how to do this well, but it involves a lot of like mental bandwidth to think about parallelization and to kind of iterate through different possible approaches that would work within tools that sort of like limit you a little bit. So I would personally love to see us continue to improve on that. And I think that's like where our company is very much headed in the next like 6 months or so.
Man, that is so exciting to hear for a lot of different reasons, because this is something I am extremely passionate about, and I think deeply a lot about. And I crave all these parts of the life cycle eventually becoming automated to some degree, where it just feels very natural. If we think about where we were, maybe like you're saying a couple of years ago, even the concept of a reasoning model, when I was using the first O3 and like O1 models to do searching for me, you're like, oh, finally, somebody gets it. You can spin up containers, run, N agents to search these different tasks. It has an, underlying purpose for your outcomes, and an agent maybe is asking questions and spinning those off and then gathering the research and bringing that back. You're like, that's super helpful, especially when I'm spec planning, even more so, because there may be a new spec that I don't really understand yet, or implementing a new API, talking to a new code repo. I need to actually dig through code. And so there's a lot of existing MCPs that I use too. Like one of them is Xcode, right? They have like, you can ask it questions about a GitHub. It's fast. It comes back and then it can implement stuff. It just kind of feels magical when it works. And there's a lot of like you're saying, there's so many different, there's almost too much. And even if one specific agent tackles it, there's still like the rest of it to do, and everyone will have to then implement them anyways. And I love that you guys are thinking about this out loud and even saying this out loud. You know, it's not that it's a secret, right? It's just like everything you're saying is public information. You even write blog posts about it, especially about the compression stuff and how you're doing your thing. So it's not a secret that you do this stuff very well, or you do this stuff and then you publish about it, and then gets more people in the industry to really talk about it. And like, it's, to me, impressive. Like, I think I'm thinking back to that conversation again with Andre Karpathy, and somebody was talking about, you know, this is the year of agents, 2025. We're almost done with 2025, literally like 2 months left, less than 2 months. And the conversation I think that recently came up is like, oh, it's going to be a decade of agents. And we can kind of start to see why, right? As we are on the frontier, as you guys are on the frontier trying to solve these problems, I'm seeing around the corner, you're like, okay, but there's these other ones, and then there's these other ones. And I would say that everyone who's watching this live stream right now, who will be watching it, who has an interest in this topic, we can already see that that's already been true for a while. That, like, you know, of course we know AI is not going to take our jobs tomorrow, but there's a lot of work, there's a lot of intelligence behind the model, there's a lot of different phases and the steps along the way. And for me, using it day to day, I'm starting to discover, oh yeah, like this is something new, this is something new, these are these little optimizations, like you say, that could be improved or better. And I think it's smart for people to try these different agents to get different perspective, right? Try your Claude codes, try your codexes, try your cursors, try like every single thing. Everyone's going to try different stuff. You can get an experience that's better maybe for a specific workflow here than it is over here, and so forth. And, you know, I like to try different things, and I've been super blown away with, you know, the Droid so far. And my favorite part is just I have this big feature I need to land. I just need to just go all in on it, right? Like lock in and just go. And that has been really refreshing. So I want to get some questions here. I think somebody says, question to you, Luke, are you guys doing any sort of static call map, like a sort of call graph to understand the structure of the applications? I'm still using Cursor, but I'm thinking to start using Droid.
Yeah. So I think one of the things here is right now we don't do this perhaps like well enough as we should. But I do think that our tool is really, really good in respecting Agents.MD, as Ray kind of called out a few minutes ago. And I think that is what kind of drives a lot of the core, you know, quality and performance differences that you may see when comparing us to a tool like Cursor or Claude Code. Our ability to kind of like stick to that and stick to the spec is really, really what I found to be like really, really like intuitive and easy to use, and ultimately like drives those better outcomes, right? So I think that is where we stand out. But I certainly am like open to exploring that, and I'll just like kind of spend some time diving through. Yeah,
that's cool. Revenant says, I'm planning, like, eats up their tokens, I guess. They usually burn through 10 million for creating PRDs, architectural designs, research and validations. Any tips that you can help here? Do they even need that much type of detail for these things? Maybe if they have a larger code base, or what do you suggest? If a repo hasn't been set up with this stuff, should they create that? How often should they be doing this? Or how smart is the model at understanding what's already in code from your guys' perspective?
Yeah. I think this is actually like a really good point to bring up. And it's something that we've been thinking about quite heavily, is like, we've been leaning as a company way more heavily into spec mode, but I think that there are some tools still missing in order to make that, you know, as easy to use as I would like. And specifically on the cost angle and the speed angle, we're not doing enough there. So one of the things that we're planning on rolling out this coming week is actually uh, essentially working on specs in the form of like a file. And so one of the large reasons why right now we burn through tokens when we're iterating on a spec is because we kind of like write it from scratch every single time. You should be seeing by the end of this week that that is no longer the case, and we essentially will be working on specs on your file system, so that way we can use like file editing and apply patch techniques to make that a lot more token efficient for you. Um, Yeah.
I see. Fantastic. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I think that really makes a lot of sense. So hopefully that, spec planning mode for those who are kind of getting into it should be a lot more token efficient and so forth. That's really amazing, and I'm really kind of excited to hear that. MIT Game says, how often should we clear the context for Droid? Should we start new conversations as we work on new tasks within the same code base? I'm curious because, for me, I discovered I was sort of low key YOLOing until I was like, wait, how far am I? I'm pretty far in the chat. And I checked and I was like, oh gosh, 7 million tokens. Jeez.
Yeah.
I really got into flow, but like, how should we actually think about these? How do you guys think about this as people who work on this?
Yeah, definitely. I actually think that this is a really good question because I myself have been starting to think about this more heavily in just my own workflows with Droid. Um, I personally use a lot of long sessions, and I like the fact that I don't need to front load the context as often as I perhaps used to do. And so I think that really speaks volumes to like how we've built out this like compression system for like sessions, right? So at this point, I am more confident that the compression system will keep me in the right sweet spot of tokens with the correct plan and like what I'm working on. Um, then then considering I would be better off with like a brand new session. Naturally, I think the right kind of like decision making like framework here is I think if you're working on the same related task, I think it's totally safe to continue working within one session, and you might even see some advantages there. But as soon as I'd say like move between tasks and you start to think about like inter-task parallelization, as I called out before, that's when I would actually start a new session just to make sure that like the context from your previous session remains like fully unpolluted. You can go back to that session at any point in time. Let's say like you realize, oh, the droid made a slight mistake here. I want to kind of provide it with some feedback and course correct. Then you'll still have that ability to do so.
That's fantastic. I love that question, and I love just hearing this from your guys' side too. I think that's really refreshing. um, when is the Droid SDK coming, and is there a plan for any dedicated IDE plugins like IntelliJ? I know some folks who use IntelliJ as well.
Yeah. I think so. One of the things for Droid SDK, um, naturally, like an SDK typically involves like an API SDK. And so when you think about what an API SDK really means, it's kind of built on top of typically like an open API spec that folks can share with certain providers that auto generate your SDK for you. And that's just naturally not the case for a tool that runs on your machine that is actually like a process. That being said, we are actively thinking about the Droid SDK. I would suggest for folks who want to build on top of droids right now, we do have a command called droid exec that you just type droid exec, then space the kind of like query that you have or the prompt that you want to execute, and then droid will go ahead and start working on that in a headless way. So that is, I would say, our current way of thinking about like headlessly running one or many droids in parallel to kind of reach an end goal of a task. But Droid SDK is coming. It's something that we've been using actually internally, but we want to make sure that anything that we put out to the world that will involve folks like onboarding on top of will not be like rug pulled at all for them. We want to make sure that like that API and that SDK is like fully stable before folks work on it. And I think one of the good things here is like we know that Droid Exec is here to stay. Folks can already build on top of that and get a lot of like value from it. So I would suggest doing that for the time being. But as soon as we have that, I will be sure to share it out more broadly.
Yay, that's good news. I love hearing all these little updates. This is kind of like a little fun inside baseball. Last question before we kind of move on to some other stuff is a technical question. How does Droid use a sliding window approach to maintain recent context and anchor-based compression to avoid redundant work? The way the Droid handles context is witchcraft.
Yeah. So I would actually, so Ray actually called out, there's a really good blog post on our website called Compressing Context that one of our engineers, Theo, wrote up. And he's been like thinking very heavily about how we manage context inside of our application. And so I would suggest actually, like, if you want to really deep dive, there's no better place to refer to than this document. But again, it does have to do with like the sliding window approach. Uh, the anchor points are incredibly crucial. I would say, uh, as a tool that's building on top of multiple LLMs, it's important to also test out what are the correct like kind of like compression thresholds for each LLM that you want to use, and then make sure that those anchor points kind of have adaptability in them to support those different LLMs. Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, I was just showing this on the on the blog here as far as like kind of what that was looking like. And for those folks who haven't tried Droid yet, I do have, as part of like the sponsored live stream, I should say that this live stream is currently sponsored by Factory AI, and this is literally because I've been blown away. I had a post on X. It's going crazy viral now. It's like it has over 77,000 views, and I've just been blown away with like how I've just been able to stay in one session, and it's continued to improve, over time of me using it. And there's some controversy because I still use Cursor, but I still reach back to Droid. And in my session, you can see from a couple days ago when I was using Cursor was the fact that it kept forgetting to follow my agents files. And because of using a specific database that has a certain, query and React pattern, it would forget that pattern and go back to its, normalized whatever it was trained on. And I had to basically fix all that code. And when I used Droid, 7 million tokens later in one session, I'm like, wow, I'm still here. And if you want to go ahead and try it out, I have a link in the description on YouTube. So rfer.me/rayfactory. If you're on other platforms, you just go ahead and check out that link. That's going to basically get you 40 million tokens. So if you're a new customer, you can go ahead and check that out. Get started. Try some of these long sessions. It feels interesting. If you don't want to pay for it after the fact, you can bring your own open source model into the equation as well. Also, if you're using GPT-5, you get, those tokens actually last you 80 million technically because it's only worth half as much. If you're using GLM, it's 0.25 for using the GLM model inside of Factory as well. There's a lot of flexibility, like Luke was saying. There's a lot of different ways to kind of try this out. And as part of these types of sponsorships, this is something that I like to do because I really trust a lot of these companies in terms of like when I like what they do and I want like to bring them into the community. Part of that type of deal is like, hey, you got to give something back so that everyone can actually try this out, and this is something that we actually have to use in real time. And you guys are really important to me as far as coming together and then even asking questions and participating on these live streams. So, without you guys and without everyone kind of being here together, together as a community, we're able to kind of, get some of these people in front of us so that we can, ask them these types of questions and get access. And, I appreciate that whole movement here. And I wanted to talk a little bit more, Luke, about cost. Like, how are you guys profitable? Like, are you guys like just burning money and like YOLO? Are you going to disappear tomorrow night? If I get really into Droid as a company, then, you don't get the next funding round or something and then y'all disappear? Like, what's the whole story?
Yeah. So to answer your question shortly and kind of quickly, we're not going to be disappearing. We actually just raised the Series B a few months ago, which should keep us around for a long time. But in terms of like our overall like business approach and business philosophy, we are like an enterprise first tool. So our web app has been powering enterprises for like their AI software development lifecycle journey for over 2 years now. And so we have a very sustainable way of kind of also supporting indie developers who are trying out our tool, just like in their free time or maybe using it for work, but not through like a organized enterprise deal. And so I think that is actually really, really important for folks. We're not going to be disappearing or rug pulling you guys. Our tool will always be available to use with a BYOK model. And so I would expect that to never change, as well as us also always iterating to kind of work on the best models for you. So let's say right now that's OpenAI and Anthropic. If some new competitor comes out with a model that's just as capable, we'll be on top of that, making sure that we have the right scaffold for that model, and also make sure that you can kind of bring your own key and continue usage however that best suits you. I just want to call out like our pricing for like independent developers is also really, really good. I think that our approach to kind of combine all of the good models into one like package that you can use and kind of switch between, according to like your needs for any particular session is really convenient. You don't need to manage like a max plan for Anthropic, a max plan for OpenAI. You just get access to our max plan and you have the benefits of all of those in one place. So that's kind of a bit of like our business philosophy. But I think like there's a lot still to be done in the space, and so I'm really excited about like where the future is headed in the next 6 months to a year.
I want to get your take on that. Where are we going? We're going to enter 2026, right? They said 2025 was the year of agents. Karpathy is saying we got decades to go. Can you speak to that
Yeah,
a little bit? I want to get some context from someone like you as a practitioner, literally on the ground, boots on the ground. You're seeing it, everything. I feel like you have the most purview and experience to kind of speak a little bit about this. So yeah, let us know.
yeah. I think like kind of some thoughts on the future. One of them is that I think what we're doing right now, like our company, is really meaningful, but ultimately, like we're not scared to kind of spill the beans as to how like our product works, because I don't think that that is like the moat that we have over anyone else, right? I think really what we are seeing now with like agents being so popular and really like this like framing of like the decade of agents is that this sort of like agent scaffolding will continue to improve. And so where we currently are, if we spill those beans, and which we actively do, we tell you how our tool works, right? Folks will still need to catch up to that and implement it. And it actually takes some time to get to an agent product that's reliable and that works really well. And in that time, we're going to be moving on to tackle the next set of agent scaffolding problems, which will ultimately kind of make our product even better. And so I think iterating on agent scaffolding is actually like the highest delta thing that you can do right now. And ultimately, open is really important because we think about developers from like honestly like a nearly open source perspective. I have a background in open source with Goose. I wanted to bring that to Factory as well, and so that's kind of like from like a factory product perspective how we think about like the next few months/years. But I think there's also questions about outcomes, right? So like what can enterprises or developers expect out of tools in the next year? And I think the core thing here is that I would expect, especially using tools like Droid, that the output that you get from these tools resembles that of a software organization a lot more than that of like a vibe coder, right? Nothing against vibe coding. I do it every single day, but you still need to guide the model towards kind of that structure that you want out of your code base. But I expect that to change quite radically in the next year. I think there's a lot of things that we're doing right now and thinking very actively about, like making sure that models are aware of that structure and kind of guide you towards setting up that structure if it's not there originally. Is like I think the way that we'll get there. So things like linting, end-to-end testing, unit testing, making sure that you have proper CI/CD, even for like the smallest of projects, right? Because that's like the setup that makes a software project really, really take off. So I think that's kind of like the outcomes that you can expect, as well as just longer running sessions that are more productive, that are more parallelizable in the three different ways that I kind of outlined a while back. And then I think just like in terms of building, like as a developer who's building, I think there's some core changes that are going to occur. I think we're going to see a lot more monorepos exist in the wild, and I think monorepo tooling is going to get a lot better. And so specifically, like why I say that is it has never been more important for your CI to go green altogether, right? So if you can guarantee that, then you know that whatever changes an agent has made are working together in concert, right? If you have a bunch of different repositories, that is more difficult to sort of orchestrate and reach that same outcome. So I think we'll see a lot more monorepos popping up, even for like smaller time projects. I think it's also never been a better time to learn how software works and to build some yourself, even if you don't have that background. Like I was mentioning about, changing to match more, that of a software organization. I think you're going to see that benefits folks across the board, from someone who's super experienced to someone who's just getting started building software. They'll be able to kind of intuitively learn these patterns via use of stuff like droids. And I think also one last takeaway that I have for folks building is, I think the era of migrations as we know it is a little bit, I think it will be changing. I think we see that a lot with even like the new release by Cursor, right? Like Cursor has essentially like released a 2.0 version of their app where they completely redid their application from like a UI perspective. And naturally that involves lots of backend changes, but they didn't do it from like a migration perspective. They kind of like created a new product on top of it, and then probably will like eventually like replace other things under the hood. But this idea of like building a product that is a prototype and then goes straight into like a product that you want to release. I think that's the new way of thinking about migrations. Like, we're actively thinking about how do we want to change our web app to match the capability set of our CLI tool. And I think one of the things that stands out is we're actually like building this entire web app from scratch again, because it takes us so little time to do. So in a matter of 3 weeks, we can do the amount of work that we did, let's say in a year, by using Droid to kind of automate these migrations over. And so doing so without having users on that product is actually really, really quickly to iterate. Naturally, once you have users, you want to be a lot slower and a lot more thoughtful about those changes. So I think migrations will change in that sense.
I love that thinking, because I noticed that for some of my apps too, that I can quickly spin up a better UX or something and then just move over to that super quickly. And there's less of this weight that needs to be carried release to release, right? And
Yeah.
I worked at a company, this fruit company or something that was in the Valley for a long time. And there's code there from next, step, next OS, like all the way back. You have to, right? There's like all this legacy stuff. The file systems. File systems are like 30 years old plus, right? And working on the iPhone, you're dealing with like a certain file system. And then when the file system gets rewritten, there's people who are coming from different types of things. There's an extreme amount of detail that tends to happen if you're still supporting some of these bigger systems. But like you're saying, sometimes there's a cutoff point where you just say, here on forward, we're going to do this new paradigm. And then for certain things we have to migrate, this is what's going to happen. And to me, like the Droid, almost the CLI kind of came out of nowhere for me, because that feels like a separate product than your web product and stuff like that. And I like that way of thinking. I like the way that you're kind of also thinking about that too, for the future of, where these types of things are going. It just sounds like, yeah, we're entering, even if the models get smarter, these problems still exist, because that's what's, I don't know, I feel like the model's almost like the heart that's pumping blood to the rest of the system. So now you got to have the other things that are going to, do the tasks for you. And then there's this synchronization that sort of needs to happen as a systemic thing. But then you also talked about software development lifecycle, which I really do appreciate. That's one of the things I miss as a solo builder, is that some of that stability that you get, because you can make a change and it's going to land at least on the other side of the fence. Either someone's testing it physically, or some type of test is running, so that you don't break things too much, especially if you start getting paying customers. And I think that's my biggest bottleneck too sometimes right now, that I'm sort of trying to reproduce. How do I keep track of the agents? I created the simple Kanban documentation folder structure, and then like there's other things like agentic rules, right? Agent.MD files are super important for me, because those are like the things I can almost hand off to someone. And, it's like a procedure. It's like, here's the procedures. You should always follow them. They're written down. Yeah. And that type of like, wow. Okay. There's all these crazy things. I don't know. Do you have anything that you want to touch on that we should be talking about right now that maybe we're forgetting, or that, maybe the community needs to know? Because you bring up this word again, like agent scaffolding, as like a thing that you want to kind of talk more about. We're just curious about kind of what you're thinking.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, honestly, a lot of like the things I wanted to touch on, I think I have. But one other takeaway that I think I have about just where we're headed, is I naturally see that like models in that like frontier level, something like, Claude, Opus, or Sonnet, right, are feeling really really good right now at tackling these very comprehensive tasks. You can think of delegating to Droid for like a 3 to 4 hour complexity level task. Um, Naturally, now like the question is, as models get better, does Droid just get more and more capable? I think that's one way of thinking about it, and I think that's definitely true. But there's also this other question of like, do we need those extra set of capabilities, or do we need more competitive pricing and uh, context management? Um, I think the latter is actually really really compelling, because if you can make like the pricing a lot more approachable for developers, I think you'll see a lot more adoption of these tools. And also, we've been seeing models get better so quickly. I mean, if you think back to where we were like a year ago, the change has been kind of like night and day, right? And so I'm really excited about where like self-hostable models, open weight models, models that can run on your own machine are headed, because I think that actually is the next frontier, of building on top of models, right? Building agents using those models will be a lot more cost effective, and I'm really excited about that future. Yeah.
That's impressive. I think I wanted to get into that model discussion too. I had the question back in my mind. I forgot about it, but Cursor released their Composer 1 version. We have
Mhm.
Windsurf. They released Sui version 1 a while back, and then they just made an iteration with 1.5, with their latest folks who are now part of Cognition. Amazing, like ML engineers all over the place and stuff like that. Are you guys thinking about that? Is that something that's currently on deck, or are you guys more focused on the tooling part, or kind of what's your thinking there? With all this stuff, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. In terms of just like how our approach here is structured, we want to make sure that we're shipping the best product for developers out there. And so a lot of our attention to detail is focused on the product side of things. Now, we have been experimenting with, making this product more compelling from a cost perspective, which naturally brings you to the next question of considering, your own models, fine tuning your own models, and making sure that they are like as performant as the other alternatives on the market. And so I would say that we are actively thinking about that and exploring it, in code, but I don't think we're ready to kind of ship out a model yet.
I think, yeah, that's fair. And to me, I always think about like, 80/20 type of things. And if you're already really good, for those who don't know, like in Terminal Bench, Factory AI beats out the Sonnet models using Claude Code, and then Codex models using, their own like Codex thing. And it's impressive because obviously a lot of work has gone behind understanding like this context thing. That's how I'm able to get these long sessions, and it just feels so natural. Like I don't feel like the quality degrades over time. And obviously you can try it yourself. rfer.me/Ray Factory. Get started with that 40 million tokens. Factory did sponsor this live stream, but beyond that, I want to like, to me, it sounds like you guys are doing something really good. There's some secret here that you guys have touched upon. Like if we keep going down this route, it seems like everything just keeps getting more valuable. And I like hearing your thinking about cost, but also the approach that you didn't close this off and say you only have to use our inference, right? You just said this is actually available through the CLI. You can bring your own models into it, right? You can connect your own API keys if you wanted to, right? Whether it's running your own local models or running it through the API, and kind of running in that type of thing. There's also this like Droid exec mode. So it's sort of like a headless agent that can be put into maybe a CI/CD or some other platform. And right now, is there a reason why this kind of got opened up more to the publicly, and why you didn't just kind of keep this in the enterprise level?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us are developers who love experimenting with these tools, and I think a large reason why we wanted to share this with the public more generally is I think we have something really compelling. Like one of the jokes that we have internally at Factory is like Droid is the closest thing to AGI out there, right? And so when when we're building things, suddenly people will like just like stand up from the desk and be like, "Whoa!" Like Droid just cooked, right? And like other people will come over and check it out, and you're just like, the other day we had a Sub Zero that had everyone just like you know kind of panicked, but Droid was actually the one who figured out the resolution, figured out the root cause, and so all these are moments that like we want to share with the community, and we want other developers to feel like they're involved in this kind of like magical moment of AI right now. I think there's so much creativity and so much like kind of productivity boosts that you can get out of a tool like Droid that we just want folks out there to be able to use. And ultimately, I think one of the cool side effects just from a like business perspective is if we create a really compelling tool, then there's a lot higher, like a lot greater likelihood for you to go to your engineering manager and say, hey, I've been having this like fantastic experience with this tool. Can we get the rest of my team on it? Right. So it's naturally like a win-win for everyone involved. And so I think we just need to stay, heads down on fixing and finding every single issue inside of our product, as well as like really building the future of software development. We're a team of like 35 people in San Francisco who just are so passionate about this particular problem. We're obsessed with our mission of like bringing autonomy to software engineering, and so I think our plan is to continue staying laser focused on that.
That's super incredible. I love this whole thing. And as we're kind of winding down and kind of wrapping up the live stream here, I want to touch on that point that you also made about it's more important than ever for people to learn about software development. There are several people in the chat, like this stream, earlier streams, and even my comments the last couple of days. I can feel the pain a little bit. They're junior engineers. They're maybe studying in school. They're a little bit scared about the frontier because their peers are not getting jobs that are older. And then other people who just entered the industry or they got let go or something like that. Do you have any advice for these younger people who are trying to break into the industry and so forth? How are they going to get this type of experience for software development lifecycle? I mean, what do you kind of recommend or expand? Like if you were kind of starting all over again, maybe 10 years ago, like what would that look like to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Naturally, I think you hear a lot of like negativity online about where AI is going, and I think you can hear about things like the environment effects that this is having. Like a mastermind AGI that's going to replace every single job out there. I don't think about it from that perspective, nor does anyone else at Factory. We're not building tools that will replace you. We're building tools that will make you more productive. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Like just as you're using these tools and as you're hearing like this kind of online is like make sure that you're also grounding it in kind of the way that other folks are building these tools for you, right? So that's one point. When it comes to like junior folks who are trying to join the industry, who are finding a lot of those headwinds right now, I think one thing that has helped me throughout my entire career is finding a problem that I'm incredibly passionate about. Um, Naturally, you go through like interview processes and you might get rejected, and that's always difficult. But if you can find something that you love to work on every single day, it could be because of your job or in the absence of a job. I think that is where you will grow more than in any other way, right? You're going to be iterating on this problem, thinking about it like day and night, because it's just so close to your heart. And so I would suggest for folks early on in their career, I'd encourage you to try to find that problem space that really keeps you awake, and think about it very actively. Try to work on it in your spare time, because ultimately you're going to find someone else in the world who loves to work on that too. And if you have thought about it for, let's say, a month or two, every single day, every single night, the match is just there to be had. It's kind of like how our two founders met, and just it was like intellectual love at first sight. It's the same thing here, right? It's like you can very very easily get started if you have that domain expertise that you've built up just about thinking about a problem and working on it iteratively.
I love that answer. And I think hitting your head against the wall is actually okay when you run into some of these problems, because that's actually part of the growth cycle for yourself as an engineer. And I remember those stories too. It's like, I don't have a formal engineering degree, right? And to do these things and to be put in front of problems now where like billions of people have touched the software and reliably update their phone because of stuff that you've done, it's like, that's not possible unless you keep running your head into these little problems and you really deeply care about like these little details and things. And that gets built over time. And I love that message, Luke. I think that's really important for anyone tuning in, no matter what age that you're at. The passion is going to fuel you to wake up every day. And if you have some of that pain, you know, you're going to work through it and you'll get smarter, and then you can teach other people to help you as well. And I think these skills that you learn, like you're saying, is going to create almost like a magnetism around you to draw those people into your life. And you'll naturally start to gravitate around that. I think that's such a great message for us to kind of lean on. So for folks who haven't had a chance, this is Luke Alvoeiro, and from Factory, cracked engineer, I would say. You know, like that's a term that's used a lot on Twitter, and it just means that, you know, you care deeply about your engineering practice as a discipline, with attention to detail. The level of impact that, you know, Luke has had throughout his history and his passion for these dev tooling types of things, from working at Goose, on Goose, you know, at Block, the parent company of Square, the impact there that's led into where this is going with factory droids, the decade to come with agents, with AI, as it continues to evolve. I'm really excited to see this continually, you know, grow. And for those folks who are just signing up or want to sign up, there is a link in the description. It's rfer.me/rayfactory. That'll get you 40 million tokens to go try out Droid. This is an exclusive because of the partnership that the Droid has done for this live stream. So they're sponsoring this live stream. And as something that I do with my community, is I make sure that these companies can also provide back to us so that we can try out these things and test these claims ourselves, and, you know, really put them to the fire as far as like accountability and things, and really kind of experience these things. You know, I speak on these things truthfully, and this is something you see me, like yesterday, coding live for 3 hours. You can see everything. Stuff breaks. I tell you what's happening. I take you through that process. And I'm just super delighted that, you know, Factory, yourself, Luke, here are joining in the stream, answering questions from our community today, and that folks can kind of check out this product, because this is extremely impressive stuff. And I can't wait to see you guys tackle more of these problems that you're talking about, that they're already on your mind. They're in the works here, and to continue to see this on forward. So yeah, thank you so much for joining the stream.
Of course. No, and thank you for having me. We're rolling out a bunch of those changes in the coming weeks, and we move really quickly. So I'd say if you do have any feedback or any bugs that you run into, please send them to us. We're extremely active on X, on email. We even have a open source like GitHub project that you can drop issues on. And so we just want to hear from you folks. If there's something that isn't working in our tool, we will happily fix it for you. So yeah, thanks again, Ray, for having me on.
Definitely. And like everything on here, you get to hit the like, subscribe, thumbs up, share with some friends if you feel like this could be helpful for them. If you have like a really friend who's really into AI coding, you know, share this interview with them. I think it's going to be really useful. I've also hired some editors who are going to be going through this interview, and they're going to be chopping up a bunch of bits and pieces. So you'll probably start seeing some of those kind of flying into your mainstream audience and stuff. So I appreciate everyone that's been able to get up here. Happy November. We're daylight savings time taken care of in California. In Hawaii, it surprisingly doesn't change. So it's only 8:30 here. And Luke, thank you so much for joining in. I'm excited to continue the conversation online as well. And you'll see me continue to code live with Droid, with everything, and testing this out. So definitely stay subscribed if you're into that. Ladies and gentlemen, Luke, thank you so much. Also, a huge shout out to Alberto for the last minute. He just dropped in a super chat. So I want to make sure I acknowledge that before I get off the stream, because that's really generous of him. It says, love riding the frontier with you, bro. Great stuff. Oh, wow. What a great way to end the stream. Cool. Thank you guys so much. Peace out, y'all.
Take care.